desire to have different kinds of jobs. I mean, they often describe, for example, the jobs of farming as like it's physical labor, I don't have autonomy, it's, you know, it's not very fulfilling. And so they themselves are expressing a desire for something different. And yeah, they constantly do have to contend with the opportunity cost of, do I help my parents make money now, or do I stay in school longer to hopefully help them in the future? But because they're middle school students, they aren't generally living with their parents, and so they're just attending the local school in the community.
So in effect, what you're teaching them is that they have to abandon, they're all farmer kids, one assuming,
Yeah.
so they have to abandon what would have been the tradition in their family to do something else. And that's what you're trying to get them to do.
I think, yeah, in part, or just to consider.
They don't have to graduate from high school to do farming.
Right, right. But I think they also say that, you know, they're aware of their poverty and they want to, I mean, they see this as not something for themselves, but as a goal where they can help improve their family and their society. So it's not, they're not motivated in the same way a U.S. student might be, just for themselves, but they see it as like a way to better the larger group if they can. Because it also in a collectivist culture, education is very much valued, but it sometimes is hard when there's these other hardships with financial factors. Another thing that I find interesting is I would say that, you know, things like growth mindset or incremental theory of intelligence tend to be higher among, you know, Asian students. But in this case, it's complicated by the fact that they're aware that they're from rural areas. And so there's this sense of, I think, stereotype thread around being a rural student versus a wealthy urban student. And so, you know, if you think about this system, it's very exam driven, and they're constantly having to compete with those wealthy urban students. And so there's this this sense that, well, people like me don't go to university, or, you know, I can't overcome these obstacles. So it's interesting how they have kind of competing forces in both directions. So then I wanted to look at what was the kind of additional added value of staying in middle school if they do the program. So if they do, the way I thought about it was, if they do the 8th grade camp, for every 100 low GPA students, 9 more will make it through middle school if they do that one camp. If they also do the 7th grade camp, 15 more will make it through middle school. And then if they do all 3 camps, 27 more students will make it through middle school. So it does show that, you know, some participation in the program does help, especially if it's timed right before they're most at risk of dropping out. And then last, I wanted to look at, you know, can this gap be closed? So the gap in retention between high and low GPA students. So right now, in the absence of intervention, high GPA students are graduating at 80%, whereas low GPA students are graduating with less than 30% rate. And then similarly for the average GPA students, the gap is 28%. So here you see that if they do 3 camps, in the spring of 8th grade, the gap is reduced by 87%. And then in the spring of 9th grade, it's reduced by 53%. So cutting the achievement gap or the retention gap in half. With 3 camps, there's a slightly greater benefit. It's reduced by 95% in the spring of 8th grade and 56% in the spring of 9th grade. So what do we learn from this? So at this school in Vietnam, you can see that dropout is a major issue throughout middle school, especially in the 8th grade fall. We can see that an adolescent who participates in a CFC camp gains some immunity from dropout, mainly in those 2 semesters right after the summer that they participate. So if they want to have a maintained lower risk of dropout, they have to participate in multiple camps. And then finally, CFC can help originally lower GPA students potentially catch up to higher GPA students who don't do the program. So returning back to the theory of change, we find some evidence that the program is associated with greater academic retention. So this is the 3rd study that I did, which was the randomized trial. This was the focus of my dissertation. And then I mainly focused on these psychological outcomes, goals, motivation, efficacy. And I asked them both about middle school and about higher education, since I thought their views on those might be different. So this is just a standard question. What is the effect of the program on the average student at the level of intent to treat? So that just means if they were randomly assigned to treatment, what was the effect of that? But because I had done a pilot study the year before, I knew it would be very hard to get 100% compliance. So some people assigned to the treatment group would actually not do the program. Some assigned to the control group would do the program, because it's essentially just offered at the local middle school. We don't like forbid students from participating. So given that, I use this other technique called instrumental variables estimation. So that's a way of understanding the causal effect of participation when you have non-compliance. And so that gives you the effect of the treatment on the treated. And then finally, I wanted to see if there was a dosage response effect. Like if students had 80% attendance, would that be more effective than just some attendance at the program? My second line of questions had to do with, is the program more effective for at-risk students? So both defined as low GPA students and students who were first-time participants and had never encountered the concepts before. So the two studies I did were conducted in these two provinces. They were both poor by US standards, but they had different levels of relative poverty within Vietnam, as well as educational levels. So the red bars are showing that the dropout rate is higher for the Hà Giang province. And if you think back to the map, that was the province in the very southern part of the country. And then the higher education is higher in Da Nang, which was the province in the central region. In addition, they have different levels of wealth. So Da Nang is ranked 3rd of 63 provinces in average income, and then Hà Giang is ranked 61st of 63. So I thought it would be interesting to look at the program in these very different provinces to see if it could have similar effects. Okay, so this gray box just represents how the two studies were similar. So in each case, the students were randomly assigned within their school classes. So if they had a class of 20 students, 10 would be assigned to treatment, 10 to control. We assigned essentially encouragement to participate, since we couldn't force them to be in the treatment or control. We were just kind of nudging them to be. There were 2 sites in each province, and then in each case we compared it with their normal summer activities. I think in the future there could be studies where the control group is some aspect of the program with different components added or removed. And so this is how they differed. In Da Nang, I tried a delayed control design. So Da Nang, that was the first time we implemented it there, so I thought it would be more effective to offer the treatment to both groups. So the way it worked is Camp 1 was the treatment condition and Camp 2 was the control condition, and we measured them in between. So essentially the pre-survey for the control group was actually the post-survey for this study. In Hà Giang, I worked there for a number of years, so I knew that there was generally more demand than places, because we can only accommodate 120 students per camp, and so if 180 apply, we would have to randomly allocate those places, or allocate the places anyway, so random assignments is one fair way to do it. So we were able to create a control group that way for Hà Giang. And then for Da Nang, we had 4 different sessions. Hà Giang, we had 6, and then 7th to 8th grade in Da Nang, and 7th, 8th, and 9th in Hà Giang. So the purple just highlights the advantages of each design. So in Hà Giang, we had greater power to detect effects because we had 79 school classes and almost 500 students. In Da Nang, we had a higher control group compliance rate, and that's probably because we offered the control group a chance to participate in the program. In Hà Giang, we had greater treatment group compliance because our population was a group of self-selected volunteers, so if they were assigned to participate, it was likely they would take up the offer. The Da Nang camps only assessed 2 weeks because of a prior scheduling issue. The camps overlapped by a week, so we had to assess them after 2 weeks rather than 3. And then in Hà Giang, we had to wait several weeks until the school year started because past experience had shown if they were assigned to the control group, they wouldn't come to the camp in the summer just to do a survey. So these are the outcomes that I had. I divided it into expectancy and value, so ones that were more efficacy related, ones that were more motivation related, and then also middle school and higher education. So these were scales that I developed in conjunction with Hunter Gelbach, some of you may know, who specialized in survey design, because I needed to make sure that they were adapted to the rural Vietnamese context and could be translated easily into Vietnamese as well. So this is an example of how we measured educational attainment. For desired attainment, the emphasis on, given if there were no obstacles, how far would you wish to go in school? For expected, it was thinking realistically, how far do you actually expect to go in school? And we thought those might be different, where the kids really desired higher education, but then when they thought about what they actually could attain, it might be less. And then in addition, we asked them to give their mothers and fathers highest level of attainment. So the response options were on this same scale for both the students' goals and the parents, and so that allowed us to create these 2 different outcomes. The first, I created where I subtracted the parent's attainment from the student's goal. This was one way to, this was actually a normally distributed outcome, so it was one way to do that. And also it provided some indication of how much higher they wanted to go than their parents went. In addition, I created a dichotomous outcome where anyone who selected this option or higher was given a value of 1, and then anyone with a lower goal was given a value of 0. For the
Can
other,
I just ask a little
Yeah.
tiny detail? You did this all in Vietnamese, I assume. This is.
yeah,
So these are all, yeah.
I work with, so our college student volunteers often become staff of the program, and so I work with them to translate these into Vietnamese. But also I piloted it like 3 or 4 times to make sure they understood all the concepts. So for the other scales, we used like 6 to 8 items where we would ask questions. So this is for the motivation to go to university. So I'd ask questions like, how important would it be if it would mean you'd be different from people in your family? That might be something they would score on average low on, given their collectivist culture and how important it is to be with their families. So they chose one of these options, and then we subsequently converted them to numerical scores to form a composite. So I'm just going to go briefly through the way the instrumental variables worked. So you start with the random assignment to treatment, which is in the first stage. So you use the random assignment to predict who actually participates. And then second, you use the predicted values of that to in turn predict your ultimate outcome. So you need a measure of participation. In this case, I had some versus no participation and 80% versus less participation. Third, I needed variables that would be able to represent the at-risk students. So I used their GPA in the previous school year, as well as whether they had done the program in the past. So this was really only an option for Haozang, because in Da Nang they had not done the program previously. But you can see that their GPAs are much higher in Da Nang than in Haozang. And then I also controlled for their household wealth, the distance of their houses from the school, since that might influence who participates in their mother and father education and their gender. And again, you can see that in Da Nang, the parents' education is higher, which is consistent with the province level statistics that I showed earlier. So here are some of the results I obtained. I'll start by talking about what was similar in the 2 provinces. So what was similar was this effect on desired educational attainment. And that was actually the outcome I first reported from the first study that showed that greater participation was associated with higher educational aspirations. So it was kind of a repetition of that effect. So this is the outcome where I subtracted students' goals or parents' attainment from students' goals. And so you can see in each case it's a relatively small effect that increases with attendance in each province. Another way to look at it is using that dichotomous outcome where you predict what is the probability of desiring a university education. So here, this is showing that if you receive an offer to be in the program, it leads to a 10 percentage point difference. If you participate 80%, it's slightly higher. And then this translates into a 15 to 25% increase over the control group in each province. And then second, these are the effects that were specific to Da Nang. The program was more effective for low GPA students, and it was also more effective for the higher education outcomes. So here, this is
That was the higher GPA district or the lower?
Sorry?
That was the higher GPA district or the lower?
The higher one.
Yeah, can you just put that previous slide back? You
Yeah.
sort of slipped over it. Okay, so this is a classic, what Lee Cronbach would have called an aptitude treatment interaction.
Right.
The rich get richer.
Well, here the low
Here's
GPA
the-
students are
yeah.
benefiting. I think which is consistent with the a lot of the interventions.
I thought the unanticipated results.
Well, so I had 2 different types of outcomes: middle school and higher education, and so this is just saying that it was more effective with the higher education outcomes. So here you can see that the biggest gap is for the biggest difference is the low GPA students. So it's just saying that if they had some participation in the program, they had a 67% probability of desiring university after the program relative to 38% if they did not participate. There's a similar effect for expected attainment here, which is again a 30 percentage point difference. And then there was also this similar effect for their motivation to go to college. So you can see that for the low GPA students, which is the blue blue line, the effect is between 0.27 and 0.32 standard deviations. There was some effect for average